Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Unique Paradigms podcast. Welcome to our discussion. Our previous podcast episode discussed patterns of diaspora in the context of Tamils in Guyana. I did want to expand our discussion to support our collective effort in expanding the lens of identity development. I do seek to bring more attention to topics such as identity, feminism, generational transmissions, and also gender differences and how they have correlational relationships to self-concept and the identity formation process. As my social endeavors have extended to global communities in Guyana specifically and other parts of the Caribbean, there is a necessity in exploring existing paradigms and also the resistance to the shift to support social change, specifically in areas of educational equity, child welfare, and domestic violence. But by providing assistance across all regions and sectors in which we work, and we promote an inclusive economic growth, and we do strengthen health and education at the community level and support civil society through reforms and assisting other countries who are also recovering from disasters. So I do want to continue to move forward with partnering up with more nonprofit, non-governmental organizations in Guyana and also independently, because after my meeting, it did bring attention to many limitations that we face as a community, both domestic and abroad. This also empowered me to take a deeper look at the patterns of gender-based violence that exist in Guyana. And although it's a challenge often with measuring a population and sampling to measure that data, it did provide guidance for me to move forward with my endeavors. So I did want to extend this conversation to include this investigation of the research data and really discuss how the environment concerning social issues as a community and reflect on feminist epistemology and how that is effective for sociological research. But as we broaden our collaborations to support our community, it's essential to understand the existing paradigms that we have. Investing in gender equality and women's empowerment can unlock human potential on a transformational scale. For societies to thrive, women and girls, men and boys must have equal access to education and equal rights and opportunities as peace builders and leaders. It is also important to explore the context of masculinity and feminism with a societal culture and the variables that impact social programming and determine its effectiveness. While masculinities across geographies and culture vary and they're diverse and have intricate systems, the image of masculinity is often presented in global media and popular culture as oversimplified, and it emphasizes a toxic masculine behavior and norms. But we must also reflect on the patriarchy and the sexism that's indicated the direction of historical research and practice. Gender is often used synonymously for women. But it's the reason why I feel that exploration of domains of literature on gender relationships, toxic masculinity is important. While the concept of toxic masculinity is not new, it has yet to be applied to different contexts such as rejection violence. In the first domain of analysis, we're mainly going to analyze the stereotypes of various kinds of violence that exist. So determining what those influential factors are. Is it religious influences? Is it FGM? So the discourse is critical to theoretical practice. And as I continue my research on dimensions and contexts associated with identity and feminism, I also reflect on the varied dimensions of Indo-Caribbean identity and the current state of Indo-Caribbean feminism. We have yet to cultivate our own feminist movement, where we are acknowledging our own status and identity, generational transmission, authenticity, and overcoming challenges that are associated with social constructions such as toxic masculinity. But this is also important in the development of effective social programming to support victims of IPV, as well as sustainability in global environments. So although women are often economic providers and caretakers, the responsibility for family, community health, and education, they are often the most vulnerable to the shocks of an economic impact. So considering the current COVID-19 crisis, women are also at more risk for gender-based violence. And it has increased since COVID-19 due to the increased amounts of stress and economic insecurity and social isolation. But the concept of masculinity also is associated with gender-based violence. And I wanted to bring this forth in our discussion where we're really identifying how the concept of masculinity is socially constructed through a system of social interactions and practices. It doesn't exist outside of these constraints because it's created and sustained by them alone. So for there is no singular type of masculinity which is found everywhere. There are different forms which vary across different cultures. The form of masculinity which is dominant in a particular culture is called hegemonic masculinity. And while other masculinities may exist in the same culture, the hegemonic masculinity is the main expression of the privilege men collectively have over women. It subordinates other masculinities, marginalizing those men who do not align with the hegemonic ideal. So hegemonic masculinity is often linked to a variety of different toxic practices, including physical violence. But because it varies from one setting to another, it's impossible to say that hegemonic masculinity is synonymous with violence, but the socialized forms of hegemonic masculinity exist in various forms, and it can be studied across races and cultures. So the hegemonic position is currently an accepted male ideal with a particular culture at a particular time. So as such, the scholarly view of hegemonic male is an ideal type and often referenced in literature. But this image does change over time, as well as being contested by particular cultures. So when we are reflecting on gender relations and the current systems that exist, we have to really consider the social relations and the structures that men have over women, and especially if we take a closer look at different communities. So as we are looking at the dimensions of power, division of labor, emotional relations, we are also going to reflect upon the association of hegemonic forms of masculinity as a system that's built into those social institutions, and they appear normal and natural for men to have a subordinate position and are maintained as such. So although there is no form of masculinity that is universal, there are those that are which have harmful traits, and they do result in negative outcomes. So we do refer them often as toxic masculinities. So which is further defined as a socially aggressive male trait that serves to foster domination, the devaluation of women, homophobia, or violence. But using the term toxic masculinity is helpful when we are looking at exploring literary theories and also philosophical application of identifying patterns in hegemonic masculinity communities. So, and understanding the correlations of misogyny, entitlement, and violent domination. Toxic masculinity is implicated in a range of harmful effects, including violence against women, which is a result of the hierarchy it perpetuates, where women are less valuable. But we must also consider the roles of power. For example, rejection violence has often been discussed in literature, though it's not often termed as such. Any discussion of intimate partner violence or stalking is often a part of discussion of rejection violence. For example, research on intimate partner violence shows that most dangerous periods for a woman in an abusive relationship is the period in which she attempts to leave. As a reaction to this rejection, a loss of power, the abuser often turns violent. So when we are looking at correlations and relationships that exist between gender-based violence, abusive individuals may turn toward stalking their ex-partner after the termination of the relationship. Dennison and Stewart write that much of what is perceived to be stalking occurs with the apparent motive to initiate a relationship or reinstate a relationship. Both stalking and post-relationship violence can be construed as rejection violence. So this is a pattern that is growing in our community. The Guyana Women's Health and Life Experience Survey in 2018 is the first report to provide a comprehensive examination of the nature and prevalence of violence against women and girls in Guyana. The data reported patriarchal norms in which the social status of men and boys is higher than women and girls. So we are seen as subservient to the subject of authority of the counterparts and a main driver for the violence against women and girls. So Guyanese culture continues to harbor attitudes that perpetuate violence against women and girls, such that women's primary responsibilities have been viewed as just remaining within the home and that men are the natural authority. So these persistent sociocultural norms and enduring inequalities have given a rise to the prevalence of IPV in Guyana. So Guyanese women experience IPV at a significantly higher rate than the global average of 1 in 3 women. 55% of the survey respondents who have had a male partner have experienced some form of IPV during their lifetime. 38% of them have experienced physical and or sexual violence. More than 1 in 10 have experienced physical violence from a male partner in the last 12 months. So the data is staggering. The harms associated with IPV also spans generations and can result in indirect effects on a woman's family. So as an early indicator of trauma and intergenerational violence, twice as many mothers who have experienced IPV report their children had or were having nightmares. So IPV does have adverse effects on all aspects of women's lives. Compared to women who did not experience physical IPV, twice as many women who did report trouble with walking, undertaking unusual activities, memory, and concentration. There are also reports of suicidal thoughts and attempts 3 times the rate of women who have never experienced IPV. In semi-structured interviews, victims divulged contemplating and attempting suicide during pregnancy out of desperation to stop the violence against them. Until this study, Guyana did not collect national level data on violence against women and girls. So previous data could suggest the same patterns. For example, the civil society organization Help and Shelter is the domestic violence crisis center and shelter in Guyana, and they reported between 1995 and 2018, 9,966 women and girls, 1,879 men and boys sought and received face-to-face gender-based counseling. The median age respondents is also an indicator. The median was 37, with nearly half younger than 35. 3/4 live in rural areas as well, 64% and 10% respectively. The majority of the respondents also self-identified as Indian. 36%, 27% were of African ancestry. Included faith as well. About 70% of the respondents identified as being Christian. But additionally, about 93% of respondents reported having a regular male partner at least once in their lives, and primarily the type of partnership is cohabitated, either married or unmarried. Though 1/3 of women reported their first partnership as having before the age of 18. So women in Guyana often marry at a young age, around 21 on average. In this study, the observation of power and control can be inferred. Only 40% of women reported working outside the home, while nearly 37% identified household labor as their main occupation. Most respondents contributed to the household finances either in equal share with their partner or primarily from their own income, about 20%. I do reflect upon Judith Butler's perspective of gender as a performance indicator. Although it may have its flaws, it's useful to explain why patriarchy persists and how it can be changed. Patriarchal masculinity is very good at adapting to the changing times without losing much power, whereas anti-patriarchal masculinities are very good but less successful at opening up masculinity to other styles of performance, including its dissolution of gender-neutral variants. I grant that before the emergence of hegemonic masculinity, there was not a single concept to explain the oppression of women and of marginalized men. So they did make a good job of explaining this in literature, where we can clearly identify power in the perfect niche circle to express a sense of entitlement from different power figures, whether it was Trump or down to an unemployed man who lashed out at wife and children. So in the lens of Indo-Caribbean identity and identity formation and the selection of Indian identity, it's a personal perspective on how we self-conceptualize whether Caribbean identity or Indian identity. So there is going to be a variance when we look into how we have been socialized. When we think of perceptions where Indian identity may be low, there is often a rejection from South Asian communities that influenced their dissociation, or there were linguistic barriers. And in some cases, caste oppression have affected solidarity efforts. So this creates unnecessary barriers as we seek to understand patriarchal norms and sexism as they have assimilated into our society, and yet to define what hegemonic masculinity is prevalent in our community. But we are also divided in having a voice in the discussions as we navigate gender in patriarchy. The association is personal and formed by many influential factors due to personal experience or cultural exposure. But there are generational transmission of patriarchy, caste oppression, and colorism that have assimilated into Guyanese society, as well as the perception of masculinity. The history of women as maternal symbols in post-colonial spaces, such as India and other diasporic communities, especially in relation to processes of both colonialism and nationalism, even hundreds of years later. In Spivak's words, the colonialists were already involved in white men saving brown women from brown men, so thereby projecting colonized women as constantly subjugated the indigenous nationalists further consolidated this metaphor by sidelining women in the nationalist movement. In the context of Indo-Caribbean identity, we can qualitatively and quantitatively measure these experiences and behaviors across different diasporic communities in different countries to further research and identify where correlations exist, measuring these perceptions, but also introducing future studies to determine these behaviors. Transformation lies in the relationships between practices and the meanings in daily life. Identity is personal, but it's greatly influenced by the environments we reside in. In general, IPV decreases with women's increasing educational achievement. However, the difference between economic and emotional violence experienced by educational attainment is stark and significant in Guyana and other parts of the Caribbean. The study reported that women who attained education beyond the secondary level reported half the economic violence as those who have only attained primary education, or less and 9% less than those who have attained secondary education. So nearly half of the same women report experiencing emotional violence, while under 40% of less educated women did. The diaspora influences our community. These relationships do need further exploration. I will continue to shift these paradigms with you. Talk to you all soon.